I was only 5 years old when my world fractured in a way I didn't even have words for. The day began like any other outing. My parents had insisted on taking me to the mall, bright, crowded, full of color and noise, a place where children's laughter mingled with the soft hum of escalators and the scent of cinnamon from the pretzel stand. I remember holding my mother's hand as we walked past the glass-fronted stores, looking at the sparkling displays. I felt small, but I felt safe, or at least I thought I did. We wandered through the aisles of a toy store. I remember being captivated by the rows of dolls with perfect hair, the shelves lined with shiny cars, and the racks of stuffed animals that seemed too soft to touch. My parents let me pick a small toy, and I felt a rare flutter of excitement in my chest. For a moment, the world seemed normal, but it wasn't. The first cracks in my sense of safety were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but a child notices things adults might overlook. My mother's hand grew cold. Her smile seemed forced, and there was a tension in the way my father moved, as though he was eager to get somewhere I wasn't allowed to follow. They told me to wait by the fountain in the center of the mall while they ran an errand. I was excited at first, imagining they would return quickly with a surprise. The fountain was large, circular, and sparkling with cascading water. Children laughed around it, tossing coins and making wishes. I stood on tiptoe, leaning against the edge, trying to peer into the water as though I could glimpse some magic at the bottom. I waited, the sound of water and chatter around me soothing for the first few minutes. Then minutes turned into an hour. I began to panic. I called their names softly at first, then louder, my small voice swallowed by the cavernous space. No one answered. The people around me moved in waves, oblivious to the child standing alone. I felt invisible, a tiny figure adrift in a world too big to contain me. I tried to look for familiar faces, scanning the crowds for my parents, but the more I looked, the more hopeless it felt. Each moment stretched painfully, the vibrant colors of the mall dimming in my eyes, turning into a blur of shadows and strangers. Hours passed, or maybe it felt like hours. Time seemed to stretch endlessly when you are alone and terrified. My stomach ached, my throat burned from crying. My small fingers clenched the strap of my backpack, a makeshift anchor in a world that had shifted beneath me. I wondered if they had forgotten me, if they had decided I was too much trouble, or worse, if they didn't want me at all. The thought made my chest tighten with fear, but also with a strange, sharp pang of sadness I couldn't name. I had no context for this feeling, no words to express it. All I knew was that the people who were supposed to protect me, the ones who brought me into the world, were gone, and I had no idea why. Eventually, a mall security guard found me. I don't remember his face clearly, only that his uniform felt strange and foreign, like a barrier between safety and danger. He crouched down to my level and asked my name, my parents' names, my address. I tried to answer, my words tumbling out in a jumble of fear and confusion. My tiny heart pounded in my chest as I realized that I couldn't explain why they weren't there. How could I? I didn't understand it myself. The guard led me to the security office, a small room with harsh fluorescent lighting and a single chair that was too big for me. I sat on it shivering while he made calls and tried to locate my parents. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The mall continued to hum and bustle outside, completely unaware that a child was lost, completely unaware that my life had already changed in a way I couldn't comprehend. I clutched the backpack my mother had given me, the only possession I had left that belonged to them, and stared at it as if it might contain answers. There were no answers. When the social workers finally arrived, they asked me questions, but all I could do was cry. Cry for the warmth that had vanished, cry for the hand that would not return to hold mine, cry for a sense of security I had never truly had but had once believed existed. They tried to comfort me, but no adult could erase the terror that had already settled in my chest. I was given temporary care, moved to a small, sterile room filled with other children who all had their own invisible scars, their own quiet tragedies. None of them spoke to me. I didn't speak to them. We all understood that words were insufficient to capture the loneliness and fear that hung in the air like a heavy fog. That night, as I lay on a small cot staring at the ceiling, I thought of my parents. I remembered my mother's voice, the soft lullabies she used to hum. I remembered my father's laughter, a sound that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I couldn't understand why they had left me. I tried to make sense of it, tried to imagine a scenario where leaving me alone in the mall was not an act of cruelty, but no scenario fit. The truth was simple, brutal, and incomprehensible. They had chosen to abandon me. They had decided, for reasons I could not understand, that I was expendable. And as a 5-year-old, there was nothing I could do to change that, nothing I could say to make them come back. Days blurred into weeks. Every day I hoped they would return, that they would walk through the door, apologizing, explaining, promising that it had all been a mistake, but they didn't. Phone calls came for other children, family visits happened for other kids, and I watched silently from the corner. I began to realize that I was different, that the life I had known, the family I had believed in, no longer existed. I was on my own. Though I was not alone in the strictest sense, adults were around, watching, checking in, documenting my presence, but none of them belonged to me. None of them were mine. I remember one particular night vividly. I sat by the window of my small room in the foster center, the city lights twinkling like stars below. The wind rustled the trees, and I imagined my parents walking past, noticing me through the glass, feeling regret, realizing their mistake. I pressed my small hands against the cool glass, willing them to appear, willing them to make it right. But the window stayed dark, and the city moved on, indifferent. That was the first time I truly understood the permanence of abandonment, that it wasn't something that could be fixed with apologies or explanations. It was a wound, a sudden rupture in the foundation of my life, and it would take years for me to even begin to understand its scope. I carried that day with me everywhere I went. Every loud place, every crowded room, every shopping trip reminded me of that fountain, the sensation of standing alone, the growing realization that the people who should have loved me unconditionally had walked away. My small heart learned to brace itself for disappointment, to expect that anyone I cared about could vanish without warning. Trust became a fragile thing, to be extended sparingly and tested endlessly. Love felt dangerous because it came with the risk of another disappearance. I built walls around myself, invisible to the adults who observed me, invisible to the other children who didn't understand my fear. But those walls were all I had, a meager shield against the world's capacity for betrayal. Even as I grew older, that memory never faded. It lingered like a shadow, subtle but persistent, influencing the way I interacted with people, shaping the way I saw family, shaping the way I understood the meaning of safety and belonging. The mall, once a symbol of wonder and excitement, became a monument to loss, a place where a 5-year-old learned that love could be conditional, and that those who brought you into the world might also be the ones who abandoned it. It was a lesson no child should have to learn, and yet it was the one I carried with me as I navigated the world, forever changed by that single cruel act. The first time I met the man who would eventually become my adoptive father, I didn't fully understand who he was or why he kept visiting me. At that age, after everything I had already endured, adults felt like weather, unpredictable, shifting suddenly, sometimes warm, sometimes terrifying. I had learned not to attach myself too quickly, not to expect too much, because expectations had a way of breaking your heart. But he wasn't like the others who came and went, promising things they couldn't keep. He had a quiet presence, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. Something about his eyes felt steady, like he was actually seeing me, not just a child waiting for a home, not a case number in a file, not a responsibility to be managed. At the foster center, the days blurred together. Meals were scheduled, playtime was scheduled, naps were scheduled, but nothing felt stable. Children arrived and left. Some returned to their families, some moved in with relatives, some, like me, had no one coming back. I remember watching other kids clutching new teddy bears or backpacks gifted by prospective adoptive parents while I sat quietly in the corner, pretending I didn't care somewhere. Deep down, I had already accepted the idea that no one would choose me. After all, if my own parents didn't want me, why would anyone else? But this man kept showing up, not every day, not in a way that overwhelmed me, but consistently. He spoke softly, not out of pity but out of genuine interest. He would sit cross-legged on the floor beside me as I colored or lined up toy cars. He asked me about my favorite things, my favorite color, my favorite snack, my favorite cartoon. I always hesitated before answering, afraid that my answers might be wrong somehow. Afraid that liking the wrong thing might make him decide I wasn't what he wanted. But he never corrected me. He never judged. He just listened. There was a warmth in his smile, but it wasn't the forced smile of someone pretending to be nice. It was gentle, patient, the kind you give when you're not trying to get anything in return. One afternoon, he brought a book with him, a children's book full of animals and bright colors. He asked if I wanted him to read it. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. He opened the book and began reading, his voice calm, steady, soothing. I inched closer as he read, drawn in by the cadence of his voice, the softness of his tone. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe enough to let my guard down, even if only for a few minutes. Weeks passed, and every time he visited, something inside me loosened. I found myself waiting for him without admitting it to anyone, not even to myself. When I heard footsteps approaching the playroom, my heart would skip, and I would pretend not to look up until I recognized his shoes. And each time he walked through the door, he greeted me as if seeing me was the best part of his day. One morning, my caseworker pulled me aside and told me that the man had filled out all the paperwork to begin the adoption process. I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. Adoption was a big word, too big for me to grasp. But I saw the excitement in her face, the hope in her voice. She told me he wanted to give me a home, a real home, not just a bed in a room of many beds, not temporary care, not a holding place where children waited for their futures to be decided. A permanent home, with him. I remember feeling scared, almost panicked. What if he changed his mind? What if he realized I wasn't enough? What if he left me too, once he saw everything wrong with me? But every fear I had dissolved the day he took me to his home for the first time. His house wasn't enormous or luxurious. It was a modest 2-story home with light cream walls and a small garden in the front. But to me, it felt like a palace. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and laundry detergent, warm and comforting. And everything was clean, not because it was staged or prepared for a guest, but because he cared for his home the way people care for things that matter to them. He showed me the room that would become mine. The walls were painted a soft blue, and there was a small bed with dinosaur-printed blankets. On the dresser sat a nightlight shaped like a moon. None of it was extravagant, but it was clearly chosen with thought. It was the first time in my life someone had prepared a space just for me, a space that belonged to me, not shared with other kids, not handed down, not temporary. Mine. He didn't pressure me to call him anything. Not Dad, not Sir, not even his first name. He simply told me, call me whatever makes you feel comfortable. That freedom was unfamiliar. Most adults insisted on something, demanded obedience, set rules before trust. But he wanted me to feel safe first, to find my own pace. Slowly, my days began to change. I learned routines that didn't shift depending on the chaos around me. Breakfast at 7. School at 8. Afternoon snacks waiting for me when I returned. Dinners cooked together, simple meals like spaghetti or grilled cheese, and afterward we'd watch cartoons or read stories. It wasn't perfect, but it was consistent, and consistency was something I had longed for without realizing it. He taught me how to ride a bike, running beside me, until I learned to balance on my own. He cheered for me at school events, took pictures, clapped louder than anyone else when I brought home drawings from art class. Each time he smiled at me with pride, a tiny crack in the wall around my heart healed. He attended every meeting with my teachers, making sure I was doing well both emotionally and academically. If I struggled with anything, schoolwork, nightmares, memories, I never had to hide it. I never had to fear punishment or anger. He would sit with me, offering comfort without judgment. Sometimes he would tell stories about mistakes he made as a kid, just to make me feel less alone. His stories always ended with a lesson, but not the kind that felt forced or moralistic. They felt human. The official adoption day arrived months later. It was held in a small courtroom with beige walls and harsh fluorescent lights. The judge looked over documents, asked a few questions, and then smiled warmly. When he declared the adoption official, my new father squeezed my hand gently. I remember looking up at him, overcome with emotions I didn't have names for. Relief, gratitude, fear, hope, everything mixed together. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He understood. Life with him slowly reshaped my understanding of family. Family wasn't defined by blood or DNA or last names. Family was defined by choice, by effort, by love offered without conditions. He never tried to erase my past or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, he encouraged me to talk when I was ready, and on the days when I couldn't, he sat with me in silence, letting me know I didn't have to carry everything alone. As the years passed, he became more than a father figure. He became the foundation of my life, the steady support that guided me through school, through friendships, through heartbreaks, through every milestone. His beliefs in me fueled dreams I never thought I was allowed to have. He pushed me gently toward success, always celebrating my steps forward, but never criticizing my steps back. I often wondered why he chose me, why he decided to take in a child who came with emotional scars and a complicated past. One evening, when I was older, I finally gathered the courage to ask him. He smiled thoughtfully and said that he didn't choose me because he felt sorry for me. He chose me because he saw potential, resilience, and goodness in me that reminded him of the person he wished he had been at my age. He said he wanted to give me the chance to become everything I was meant to be, without the weight of abandonment holding me down. His words stayed with me for years, guiding me through the transitions of life. He wasn't perfect, but his imperfections made him even more real, more trustworthy. He apologized when he was wrong, something most adults rarely did. He listened when I spoke. He supported my decisions even when they differed from his own. He loved me in a way that felt steady, unshakable, unconditional. He continued to walk beside me through every challenge and every victory, and with each passing year, I grew more aware of the immense gift he had given me, not just a home, not just stability, but a new beginning, a second chance at childhood, and a life shaped by love rather than abandonment. The day I received the news of his passing is etched in my memory like a storm frozen in time. I had just returned home from school when the call came, the voice on the other end trembling with sympathy, and I didn't immediately understand the words. I heard passed away, heart attack, sudden, and then the world seemed to tilt beneath me. My body froze as though the room itself had become heavy and unyielding. For a moment I could not breathe, I could not think. I only sat there, staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what had just been said, and failing. He had been more than a father. He had been the foundation of my life. Every step I took, every confidence I held, every lesson I learned I owed to him. His love had shaped me, molded me into someone who could navigate the world without fear of abandonment, someone who could trust and believe in goodness even after everything I had been through. The thought of never seeing him again, never hearing his voice, never feeling the warmth of his hug again, was a pain so raw it made my chest ache in ways I didn't know were possible. The days that followed were a blur of grief, arrangements, and quiet moments alone in the house we had shared. His presence lingered everywhere. The smell of his cologne in the hallway, the worn slippers he left by the door, the books stacked neatly on the coffee table. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, half expecting to see him in the kitchen, preparing tea, humming softly to himself. I wanted to believe that this was some cruel mistake, that he would walk through the door any minute, smile at me and say, "It's okay, I'm still here." But he didn't come. It was during this time of sorrow that I received another call, this one from his lawyer. I didn't know what to expect. I thought perhaps it would be mundane, about papers or his belongings. But as I sat there in the quiet of his house, the lawyer's voice was measured, deliberate, and I could tell immediately that what he was about to say was significant. He explained that there had been a will, prepared meticulously, clearly, and legally binding, and that I, the child he had adopted and raised, was the primary beneficiary. My first reaction was disbelief. I laughed, a hollow, incredulous sound that didn't belong in the room. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. I don't understand. Why would he do that?" The lawyer was patient, explaining that there was no mistake. He had left me an inheritance of $2. $7 million. My heart pounded, not with excitement, not with joy, but with the surreal shock of trying to reconcile grief with something so unimaginable. Money had never been a central part of my life with him. He had always emphasized values over wealth, kindness over possessions. To think that he had planned this, that he had ensured my future in a way that went beyond love, was almost too much to process. As I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling, I remembered all the years we had spent together. The days he had spent teaching me to ride a bike, the nights he had stayed awake when I was sick, the encouragement he had given me through every small achievement. He had never once mentioned money or inheritance. He never needed to. And yet, here it was. A testament to his foresight, a gesture that ensured I would never again face the uncertainty or fear that had defined my early childhood. I was overwhelmed, not just by the amount, but by the thoughtfulness behind it. It wasn't about luxury or status, it was about security, about freedom, about the ability to live a life without the shadow of abandonment ever again. The lawyer handed me the sealed envelope containing the full details of the will. I didn't open it immediately. I couldn't. My hands shook too much, and my mind felt like it was suspended between disbelief and sorrow. Finally, after what felt like hours, I unfolded the documents. The pages detailed everything: the assets, the accounts, the properties, and finally, the explicit declaration that all of it was for me, the child he had chosen, the child he had loved, the child he had raised as his own. Every word resonated like a promise that even in his absence, his care for me would not falter. I walked through the house that evening, holding the papers in my hands as though they were fragile, sacred objects. Each room seemed to echo with memories: our shared laughter in the living room, quiet reading afternoons in the study, late-night talks in the kitchen. I realized then that this inheritance was not just money. It was a symbol, a continuation of his love, a concrete manifestation of the trust he had placed in me, the same trust he had shown every day of my life. The reality of it began to sink in over the next few days. $2. $7 million was a staggering amount for a child, for a young adult, for anyone. But it was not just the wealth that mattered, it was the statement it made, that I deserved a life of opportunity, a life free from fear and uncertainty, that I, a child once abandoned, could now have the freedom to pursue my dreams, to build a future, to make choices unhindered by financial constraints. And yet, it also brought a wave of unease. It was a life-changing sum. But with it came responsibility, expectation, and a sense of awe at the enormity of the trust he had placed in me. I found myself wandering through the rooms, imagining all the things I could do, all the doors that this inheritance might open: education, a home of my own, travel, opportunities that had once seemed out of reach, yet my thoughts always returned to him. How he had managed to provide not just love, but security, even in his final act. How he had foreseen the fragility of my past and created a future where I could thrive. It was overwhelming to think that someone had cared so deeply, that someone had imagined a life for me that I had never dared to imagine for myself. As the days passed, I started to organize the practicalities: bank accounts, legal documentation, consultations with financial advisors. Every signature, every form felt surreal. It was not just wealth, it was a new chapter, one that demanded responsibility and maturity far beyond my years. I spent hours sitting quietly, staring at the documents, thinking of him, trying to imagine the decisions he had made when he prepared the will. It was almost like hearing his voice again, guiding me, telling me to be careful, to be wise, to carry forward the values he had instilled in me. I also realized that the inheritance carried with it the weight of history, the contrast between my past and my present. The child who had been left alone in a mall, trembling and terrified, had now received a gift that could never be taken away: a gift that was as much about redemption as it was about financial security. It was a reminder of how far I had come, of how the kindness and foresight of one person could rewrite the trajectory of a life that had once seemed destined for instability. Late at night, I would sit by the window, looking at the city lights, imagining him watching over me, smiling. The inheritance was tangible, yes, but it was also intangible, a symbol of trust, of love, of unwavering belief in me. It gave me more than money. It gave me validation, reassurance, and the knowledge that I was never truly alone, that someone had always believed in me, even in ways I could not fully comprehend until now. There was a sense of surreal disbelief that I carried with me during this time. How could life have shifted so dramatically? The boy who had been abandoned, terrified, and alone was now someone entrusted with a legacy, someone capable of taking on the responsibility of a fortune with the guidance of the love that had shaped him. It was a paradox, a mixture of sorrow and privilege, grief and opportunity, and navigating it all felt like walking a tightrope between mourning and gratitude. I began to think about the possibilities this inheritance opened. It wasn't about extravagance or indulgence. It was about creating a life that I could be proud of, one that honored the love and sacrifices of the man who had raised me. I thought about education, travel, experiences I had never dared to imagine. I thought about helping others, perhaps children who, like me, had faced abandonment and uncertainty. The inheritance became not just a means of survival or comfort, but a tool to shape a meaningful life, one built on the principles of care, stability, and generosity that he had embodied throughout his life. And yet, alongside excitement and gratitude, there was a shadow of doubt. How could I measure up to the trust he had placed in me? How could I ensure that this gift, this profound act of faith, would not be squandered, misused, or misunderstood? Every decision, every choice, now felt amplified, as though the weight of his life, his intentions, and his love rested upon my shoulders. It was both empowering and daunting, and I spent countless hours wrestling with the responsibility of it. If you want, I can next expand the biological parent's return. After years of silence, the biological parents suddenly reappear to sue the narrator, claiming the money belongs to them, section into a 1,200-plus word story-style continuation. This would seamlessly follow the adoption and shocking will sections, keeping the emotional flow intact. Do you want me to do that? I had thought that chapter of my life was closed. I had survived the abandonment, healed slowly over the years, and built a life around the love and guidance of the man who had adopted me. I had believed that the pain of being left behind in a mall at 5 years old was a wound I had learned to live with, one that defined a part of me but no longer controlled me. The world felt stable, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel safe, confident, and even optimistic about the future. Then the letters arrived. At first I ignored them. They were unsigned, formal-looking, and slightly intimidating, with official letterheads and legal terminology I didn't fully understand. They were confusing, but I assumed they were clerical mistakes. Some distant relative attempting to contact me on behalf of a long-forgotten matter. But as the letters continued, increasing in frequency and urgency, I realized that this was something deliberate. The handwriting, the tone, the insistence, they were unmistakably personal. I will never forget the day the first lawyer arrived in person. The man introduced himself formally, his eyes serious, his demeanor firm. He handed me a thick envelope and explained that it contained legal papers concerning a claim against the estate of the man who had adopted me. My heart skipped a beat, an instinctive warning that something was terribly wrong. I took the envelope with trembling hands, sat down, and slowly opened it. Inside were pages of legalese, accusations, and claims that made my stomach drop. My biological parents, the very people who had left me in a mall and disappeared from my life, were claiming a right to the $2, $7 million inheritance. I read and reread the documents, unable to comprehend the audacity, the surrealness, the cruelty of it all. How could they, after years of absence, after leaving me completely alone at the age of 5, suddenly appear, seeking compensation for the very fortune that had been left to me by the man who raised me? They wrote about their entitlement, about their rights as biological parents, their tone cold and transactional, as though love, responsibility, and care could be measured on a balance sheet. I wanted to laugh, but the laugh caught in my throat, replaced by a sharp, raw edge of disbelief and anger. Memories I had buried deep began to surface, unbidden and painful. I remembered the day they had left me in the mall, the sense of betrayal, the tears that would not stop, the helplessness of a small child abandoned in a crowd of strangers. I remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep, wishing for them to return, wishing for explanations I would never receive. I remembered the foster homes, the feeling of impermanence, the constant anxiety of wondering if anyone would ever truly care for me. And now they had the audacity to demand a share of what had been given to me, what had been earned through the love, patience, and devotion of someone who had actually been a parent in every sense of the word. I could feel my hands shake as I held the papers, the weight of injustice pressing down on me. How could someone so cruel, so neglectful, have the gall to assert ownership over something that had never belonged to them in the first place? It was as if they wanted to erase the years of love, the sacrifices, the guidance, the stability that had shaped me into who I had become. They were attempting to rewrite history, to claim the rewards of a life they had abandoned, to profit from a child they had discarded without a second thought. The legal proceedings began shortly thereafter. I remember walking into the courthouse for the first hearing, my stomach in knots, my hands clammy, my mind racing. The building smelled of polished wood and cold metal, of dust and quiet authority. I looked around and saw people in suits, lawyers, clerks, and the occasional curious passerby. And then I saw them, my biological parents. They looked older than I remembered, wearier, but their eyes were sharp, calculating, full of the same entitlement that had fueled their claims. They did not acknowledge me, did not attempt to make eye contact, as though the past never happened, as though they had every right to enter my life now and demand something that was never theirs to begin with. The courtroom felt surreal, almost dreamlike. The judge spoke with authority, the lawyers presented their cases, and I sat there, gripping my chair, listening to the arguments unfold. They spoke of inheritance rights, legal technicalities, and claims of neglect, attempting to twist the narrative to portray themselves as victims rather than the perpetrators of abandonment. They spoke of me as though I were a commodity, an object over which they had some moral or legal claim. Each word they uttered stung, not because it contained any truth, but because it attempted to diminish my life, my experiences, and the person I had become. My lawyer, patient and firm, reminded me to stay calm, to let the evidence speak for itself, and the evidence was irrefutable. Witnesses testified to the circumstances of my abandonment, including the mall security guard who had found me and the social workers who had documented my case. Statements, reports, and records painted a clear picture of the neglect, the deliberate decision to leave me behind, and the subsequent years of absence. The story they tried to sell, of caring parents suddenly separated from their child by unfortunate circumstances, fell apart under the weight of documented facts. Every time I thought of them sitting there, expecting to reclaim something they had no claim to, I felt a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a strange kind of sorrow, not for them, but for the child I had once been, the frightened, abandoned 5-year-old who had no voice, no power, no advocate. I realized that, in many ways, I had spent my entire life preparing for this moment. Every lesson I had learned, every ounce of resilience I had developed, every shred of confidence that had been instilled in me by the man who had adopted me, all led to this moment when I could finally defend not only my inheritance, but the life that had been hard-won through love and care. The hearings went on for weeks. Each day brought new witnesses, new testimonies, and new attempts by my biological parents' lawyers to twist the narrative. But each day also reinforced the truth: I had been abandoned. I had been left alone in a world that did not care for me. And the fortune that had been given to me was not a prize for my survival. It was a deliberate act of love and foresight by the man who had raised me, the person who had actually been a parent in every sense that mattered. Outside the courtroom, life felt tense and fragile. I walked the streets with my head down, feeling eyes on me, wondering if anyone recognized me, wondering what kind of story they imagined behind the neatly pressed suits and the solemn expressions. I thought of all the times I had imagined my parents returning, apologizing, explaining, making everything right. And now I realized that the fantasy I had clung to as a child was not only shattered, but perverted. They were not here to apologize. They were here to claim something that was never theirs, to benefit from a life they had rejected. I spent hours alone in my apartment, rereading the legal documents, thinking about the man who had adopted me, the life he had built for me, the values he had instilled. I realized that the inheritance was not just money, it was a symbol of trust, care, and continuity, and now my responsibility was to protect that symbol, to ensure that his intentions were honored, and to prevent the very people who had caused so much pain from profiting from it. I felt a fierce determination, a resolve born from years of survival and resilience, that I would not allow the past to be rewritten in their favor. The courtroom battles were emotionally exhausting. I would often leave feeling drained, my mind swirling with memories, emotions, and the surreal reality of facing the people who had once left me alone. But each day, each testimony, each piece of evidence brought clarity. I began to understand the power of truth, the importance of standing firm, and the necessity of defending not just my inheritance, but my life story. The 5-year-old who had been abandoned could not speak for herself, but the adult I had become could, and she would not remain silent. As the hearings progressed, the stark contrast between my life and theirs became painfully clear. I had been given love, stability, and opportunities. I had built a life that reflected care, responsibility, and gratitude. They had spent years absent, indifferent, and now sought to insert themselves into a narrative they had no part in. The injustice of it was almost incomprehensible, and yet I had to face it head-on, drawing on every lesson I had learned, every ounce of courage instilled in me by the man who had raised me, and every memory of the child I once was, who had no one to defend her. Final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom felt heavier than ever. The air was thick with anticipation, the low hum of whispered conversations blending with the squeak of polished shoes against the marble floors. I sat at the edge of my chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to steady my racing heart. Years of fear, pain, and uncertainty had led to this moment, the moment where the truth of my life would finally face those who tried to rewrite it. From the moment the judge entered, the atmosphere shifted. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every face, every expression, before settling on the case files in front of him. The attorneys moved efficiently, presenting evidence and calling witnesses to the stand. I felt a mix of dread and hope as the first witness, a retired mall security officer, was sworn in. His voice, calm and steady, carried the weight of memory and truth as he recounted the events from the day I was abandoned. Every word, every detail of his testimony painted a vivid picture of that terrifying day. The crowd, the fountain, the small child left behind, crying, confused, and alone. He described how I had been found, shivering and clutching a tiny backpack, how social services were called immediately, and how statements were taken that documented the intentional abandonment. I listened quietly, letting his words wash over me. For the first time in decades, I felt a surge of validation, a quiet but profound recognition that my memories were not just echoes in my mind. They were facts, witnessed, recorded, and undeniable. Next, social workers and case managers took the stand. They presented reports, letters, and documentation of my placement in foster care, the subsequent adoption process, and the years of care and support I had received from my adoptive father. Each document, each statement, reinforced the narrative I had lived my life by, the narrative of abandonment, followed by redemption, love, and stability. The court listened, the judge taking notes, occasionally glancing up with a steady, impartial gaze that made the room feel both intimidating and just. When it came time for my biological parents to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Their lawyers attempted to paint a different picture, describing them as estranged or misunderstood parents, trying to rewrite the story of that day, with phrases like regrettable circumstances and unfortunate misunderstandings. They spoke with confidence, their words carefully chosen to evoke sympathy, but the weight of evidence and the consistency of witness accounts left little room for doubt. Each attempt to manipulate the narrative felt increasingly desperate, and I realized the truth was beginning to shine through, undeniable and inescapable. The turning point came when the judge allowed the introduction of the original police and social service reports. The documents detailed every observation, every conversation, every statement taken on the day of my abandonment. One passage in particular struck the courtroom into silence, a direct quote from a witness overhearing my mother say, "I can't handle him anymore. Someone else can take him." That simple, devastating sentence crystallized the reality of what had happened decades ago. The audacity of my biological parents' claim crumbled under the weight of undeniable proof. As the evidence accumulated, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: vindication, relief, sorrow, and even pity. It was strange to feel pity for people who had caused me so much pain. But in that moment, I understood that their absence, their choices, and their selfishness had not only hurt me but also revealed the depth of their incapacity to be parents. Meanwhile, I had been raised by someone who embodied every principle of love, sacrifice, and guidance. The contrast was stark, almost poetic, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life I had been given. Finally, the moment arrived when the judge called for closing statements. My lawyer spoke first, eloquently summarizing the evidence, the witness testimonies, and the documented history of abandonment and adoption. They reminded the court that the inheritance was not just money. It was a symbol of love, trust, and a life built on care and commitment. They emphasized that no legal or moral argument could justify taking that inheritance from someone who had been the victim of deliberate neglect. Then the opposing counsel made their plea, attempting one last time to cast doubt, to sway opinion, to claim entitlement. But by this point, the narrative was clear. The courtroom had seen the truth, and every attempt to distort it had failed. I could feel my heart pounding as the judge leaned forward, his voice steady and authoritative as he delivered the verdict. He described the events, acknowledged the abandonment, validated my experiences, and affirmed the legality of the will, declaring the inheritance rightfully mine. In that moment, I felt a surge of emotions so intense that it almost overwhelmed me. Tears streamed down my face, not just from relief, but from the culmination of decades of fear, abandonment, and resilience finally being acknowledged. The weight that had pressed on my chest for years lifted slightly, replaced by a profound sense of justice, closure, and validation. As I left the courtroom, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt warmer than ever. I breathed in deeply, the air tasting sweeter somehow, filled with the promise of a life untainted by the shadow of those who had once discarded me. I thought of the man who had raised me, the one who had given me love, guidance, and the inheritance that had been so fiercely contested. I realized in that moment that justice was not just about legalities. It was about recognition, affirmation, and the acknowledgement of a life that had been wronged and then redeemed. The victory did more than secure the inheritance. It allowed me to reclaim my narrative, to assert that my life, my experiences, and my worth were valid and untouchable. I reflected on the journey, from the terror of being abandoned in a crowded mall, through the years of healing to the unwavering love of my adoptive father, and finally, to the courtroom where truth prevailed. Each step had shaped me, strengthened me, and prepared me to face even the most audacious claims of injustice. I realized that while the money was significant, the real triumph was emotional and moral. It was proof that those who abandon, neglect, or attempt to exploit will ultimately be confronted by the consequences of their actions. It was a testament to the power of truth, perseverance, and the enduring value of genuine love. My life had been irrevocably changed by abandonment, but it had also been irrevocably redeemed by care, protection, and justice. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a lightness I had never known. For the first time, I could fully acknowledge that the 5-year-old child who had once been lost, terrified, and abandoned had survived, thrived, and ultimately triumphed. The courtroom, with its rigid rules and solemn authority, had become a stage where justice was not only served, but where my life's narrative had been reclaimed in full. I thought about the years I had spent fearing, doubting, and wondering if the world would ever be fair. I thought about every sleepless night, every tear shed in secret, and every moment of resilience that had carried me through. And I knew, with a clarity that cut through every lingering doubt, that I had won more than a court case. I had won recognition, validation, and the undeniable affirmation of my worth. The legal battle had been arduous, emotionally exhausting, and at times overwhelming, but it had also been transformative. It had allowed me to confront my past directly, to face the people who had wronged me, and to emerge with not only the inheritance that had been rightfully mine, but also the affirmation that my life, my experiences, and my choices mattered. I had been given a voice when I had once been silenced, and the court had acknowledged it in the most powerful way possible. The courtroom experience taught me that justice is not only about rules and laws, but also about truth, integrity, and the courage to face painful realities. It reminded me that the scars of abandonment, while deep and lasting, can be met with resilience, support, and unwavering determination. It reaffirmed the lessons I had learned from the man who had raised me, that love, care, and moral courage are the greatest safeguards against the injustices life may present. That day, I left the courthouse with a sense of closure and empowerment I had never thought possible. I had faced my past, confronted the people who had caused me pain, and seen justice rendered not just in legal terms, but in the restoration of my dignity, security, and emotional peace. I knew that my life was no longer defined by abandonment or the attempts of others to exploit me. Instead, it was defined by resilience, love, and the hard-won truth that I deserved everything that had been given to me. The courtroom exposed the undeniable truth of abandonment, validating years of personal suffering. Witnesses and documented evidence reinforced the narrative of neglect and deliberate desertion. My adoptive father's legacy was honored, emphasizing love, foresight, and protection. Legal attempts to manipulate the story failed under the weight of irrefutable proof. The verdict affirmed both the inheritance and my personal dignity, providing emotional closure. I experienced a profound mix of relief, gratitude, and empowerment as justice was served. The battle highlighted the enduring importance of truth, resilience, and moral courage. Recognition of my life story became as valuable as the financial inheritance itself. I reclaimed my narrative, transforming past trauma into a source of strength. Justice not only rewarded me materially, but also restored the emotional security and validation I had longed for as a child. The final verdict felt like a bridge between my past and my future, connecting the pain of abandonment with the love and protection I had received, and reinforcing the lesson that true justice recognizes both truth and the enduring value of a life rebuilt with care and integrity.